They saw an old woman, fragile as a teacup. They saw a young waitress, invisible as the air. What they failed to see was the fire simmering behind their quiet eyes. Julian Croft, the boy king of Silicon Valley, strode into Ethelgard's that evening, believing his net worth was a shield that made him invincible and a license that made him cruel. The woman across from him, a designated national living treasure of Japan, was, in his eyes, just another asset to be acquired, a quaint relic to be digitized and mass-produced. He mocked her tradition, belittled her life's work, and ignored her very presence, certain his vision of the future was the only one that mattered. He never imagined that the waitress, the girl refilling his water glass, was more than a student struggling to pay for her mother's care. She was the keeper of a sacred flame, a practitioner of an ancient art he was about to desecrate. When she finally spoke, she did not just take an order. She shattered his world, and from the broken pieces she built a fortress. What transpired at that table was not a dinner, it was a reckoning, and it would change everything. Ethelgard's was not merely a restaurant, it was a sanctuary of old money nestled in the quiet, tree-lined streets of Boston's Beacon Hill. It was a place where fortunes were discussed in hushed tones over lobster thermidor, and deals that would reshape skylines were sealed with a handshake and a glass of 100-year-old port. The walls were panelled with dark, lustrous cherry wood that had absorbed a century of secrets. The silverware was heavy, the crystal rang with a pure, clear note, and the air smelled of beeswax, leather, and the subtle, intoxicating aroma of power. For Clara Evans, however, it was a gilded cage, a nightly performance in the art of self-effacement. At 21, Clara was a ghost. It was the most essential part of her job. As a server at Ethelgard's, her purpose was to exist just outside the periphery of her client's awareness. She was to be a silent, graceful presence who ensured wine glasses never emptied, and bread baskets were always full, fading into the damask wallpaper the moment a conversation turned confidential. She was exceptionally good at it, a skill born of necessity. The mounting medical bills for her mother's multiple sclerosis were a relentless tide, and the tuition for her own suspended studies in art conservation felt like a distant, impossible dream. This job, with its generous tips from patrons who could drop $1,000 on dinner without a thought, was the only thing keeping her family afloat. "Table 7 is yours, Clara," Mr. Albright, the manager, murmured, his voice a dry rustle of anxiety. Albright was a man perpetually on the verge of a panic attack, his starched collar always seeming a size too tight. He lived in mortal terror of the titans of industry and old-world Brahmins he served each night. "It's the Julian Croft party, the tech wunderkind. He booked the Chamberlain room. He's closing a deal with some artist from Japan. Do not, and I mean this with every fiber of my being, do not make a single mistake. Croft is known for his temper and his scathing online reviews." Clara smoothed down her crisp black apron, her movements economical and precise. "Understood, Mr. Albright. I'll be careful." "He's drinking a bottle of Screaming Eagle Cabernet, the 2012 vintage," Albright added, dabbing his upper lip with a handkerchief. "That's a $6,000 bottle of wine. Pour it as if you are handling the Holy Grail." Clara took a steadying breath and pushed through the swinging door into the main dining room. The low thrum of conversation was the sound of a well-oiled machine of influence. At one table, a federal judge was dining with a renowned surgeon. At another, the matriarch of one of Boston's founding families held court. But all that muted energy seemed to curdle and retract the moment Julian Croft and his entourage made their entrance. Croft was a man who didn't walk into a room, he conquered it. He was barely 30, dressed not in a suit, but in a ridiculously expensive black hoodie, designer jeans, and sneakers that looked like they belonged on a spaceship. He was talking loudly into his phone, one hand gesticulating wildly, forcing the other diners to lower their own voices. He radiated an aura of disruptive arrogance, the kind of new money that believed tradition was just a bug to be patched. With him were two lieutenants, clean-shaven young men in identical grey vests who looked like they had been cloned in a lab to nod enthusiastically and laugh at his jokes. Trailing them, almost swallowed by their aggressive forward momentum, was a small, elderly woman. She was Japanese, her back ramrod straight, her silver hair pulled into an immaculate chignon. She wore a simple, dark silk kimono, the fabric shimmering subtly as she moved. Her face was a landscape of delicate lines, and her hands, resting one atop the other, were gnarled and stained with what looked like ink or dye. The hands of a maker. Beside her, a younger Japanese man in an ill-fitting suit scurried along, clutching a briefcase and looking profoundly uncomfortable. While Croft loudly greeted the host by his first name and scanned the room as if expecting applause, the old woman stood with a quiet, unshakable dignity. She was an island of tranquility in his chaotic wake. "The Chamberlain room, Mr. Croft," the host said, his professional smile strained. They were led to the private dining room at the back, a space reserved for the most important clientele. Clara watched as Croft immediately took the head of the table, a grand, throne-like chair. His VPs flanked him. This left the two seats at the far end of the long mahogany table for the Japanese woman and her anxious companion. They sat and were immediately dwarfed by the scale of the furniture. Clara entered the room, her practiced smile a piece of well-worn armor. "Good evening, gentlemen, ma'am. Welcome to Ethelgard's. My name is Clara, and it is my pleasure to be serving you this evening." Croft didn't look up from his phone. He was scrolling aggressively with his thumb. Yeah. Screaming Eagle, 2012. Get it decanting, and we'll start with the Grand Seafood Tower, and some of those Wagyu sliders. Bring a dozen." "Of course, Mr. Croft," Clara said, her gaze shifting to the elderly woman. "And for the lady? May I offer her something to drink? Perhaps some tea?" Croft finally looked up, his eyes a cold, dismissive blue. He waved his hand as if shooing an insect. "Don't worry about her. Just bring her hot water. She doesn't speak a word of English. Her name is Sato. Mrs. Sato. She's just here to watch. Kenji here does all the talking." He gestured to the man with the briefcase. One of the VPs, a man named Bryce, chuckled. "Yeah, she's the... what do you call it? The face of the brand. The analog version." The men laughed. Mrs. Sato stared at the polished surface of the table, her expression serene and unreadable. But Clara, standing only a few feet away, saw what they missed. She saw the woman's knuckles, where her hands were clasped, turn a shade whiter. She saw the almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles around her serene mouth. It was a flicker of a storm far out at sea. A cold, familiar anger coiled in Clara's stomach. She recognized the dynamic. Her own grandfather, a master carpenter who could make wood sing, had been treated this way by wealthy clients who saw his skilled hands, but not the artist behind them. She had learned Japanese from him, listening as he spoke to her grandmother, in the soft, respectful cadences of his homeland. And from him, she had learned something more. He had taught her the art of kintsugi, the Japanese craft of repairing broken pottery with lacquer dusted with powdered gold. It was a philosophy as much as a craft, teaching that an object's history, including its breaks and repairs, was a part of its beauty. It was a lesson in patience, respect, and finding value in imperfection. "Hot water it is," Clara said, her voice a perfect mask of professional neutrality. "I will be right back with your wine." As she retreated to the sommelier's station, Croft's booming voice filled the room behind her. "I'm telling you, Bryce," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is the score of the century. Her family's workshop is on the brink of collapse. They're still using techniques from the feudal era. This old woman, Sato, she's a national living treasure, or some nonsense. It's a ceremonial title. It doesn't pay the bills. We're going to take her designs, scan them with our proprietary AI, and replicate them with 3D printers and a new polymer resin. We can churn out 10,000 Sato-inspired pieces a week. We'll call the brand Zenith by Sato. It's brilliant." Clara paused, her hand hovering over the decanter. She knew the name Sato. Not personally, but from her art conservation studies. Kiyosato was not just some artist. She was the master of a specific, incredibly rare form of ceramic glazing. Her work was in museums around the world. To say she used techniques from the feudal era wasn't an insult. It was the entire point. Her family had passed down the secrets of their kiln and their unique ash glaze for 16 generations. If Croft thought he could replicate that soul with a 3D printer and plastic, he wasn't just arrogant, he was a fool. She glanced back into the Chamberlain room. Mrs. Sato, the quaint relic, lifted her eyes for a brief moment. They met Clara's across the expanse of the restaurant. There was no desperation in that gaze, no plea for help. There was only a profound, quiet weariness and a deep, assessing intelligence. Clara picked up the decanter. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a desecration, and she was about to be a witness. The deep, ruby red of the screaming eagle swirled in the crystal decanter, catching the light like liquid jewels. Clara poured the wine with a surgeon's steadiness, her movements a silent ballet she had perfected over thousands of nights. "To Zenith," Bryce said, raising his glass. "To the future of art," added the other VP, Chad with a smirk. "Disrupted and democratized." Croft laughed, a harsh, metallic sound that grated on the ears. He clinked his glass against theirs with enough force to make Clara flinch, worried for the delicate stemware. He took a large gulp of the wine, a beverage meant to be savored, and swallowed it like it was Gatorade. He leaned forward, planting his elbows on the antique table, a cardinal sin at Ethelgard's. Mrs. Sato sat perfectly poised, her hands folded in her lap. She had not touched the hot water. "So," Croft said, turning his attention to Mrs. Sato. He spoke slowly and loudly, articulating each word as if addressing a toddler. "You, like Boston? Big buildings." He gestured vaguely with his hands, creating clumsy shapes in the air meant to represent skyscrapers. Mrs. Sato offered a small, graceful bow of her head. She said nothing. Croft rolled his eyes and turned back to his team. "God, it's like talking to a statue. Kenji, tell her the deal is solid. Tell her she'll be richer than she ever dreamed." The interpreter, Kenji, leaned toward Mrs. Sato and spoke in rapid, low Japanese. Clara, standing near the service sideboard, could hear him clearly. His Japanese was polite, but it was the language of commerce, stripped of the deep, honorific complexities that would be appropriate when addressing an elder of Mrs. Sato's stature. He was translating Croft's arrogance into bland, functional phrases. Mrs. Sato listened, her face impassive. When he finished, she replied with a single quiet word. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The word was wabi-sabi. It wasn't a direct answer. It was a concept, a world view. It spoke of the beauty of things imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. It was the philosophical heart of her art, and the very antithesis of Julian Croft's world of sleek, perfect, mass-produced technology. Kenji looked flustered. He turned back to Croft. She understands. She is grateful for the opportunity. Clara felt a surge of indignation. It was a blatant, cowardly mistranslation. Mrs. Sato had not expressed gratitude. She had offered a quiet, profound rebuke. The seafood tower arrived, a mountain of ice adorned with oysters, shrimp, and lobster claws. Croft and his men descended on it like vultures, their conversation a mess of tech jargon and self-congratulation. "The resin we've developed is incredible," Chad said, his mouth full of oyster. "It has the same tensile strength as her ceramic, but it costs pennies per gram. We can even program in flaws with the AI to make them look authentic. Little cracks, variations in the glaze. No one will know the difference." "That's the beauty of it," Croft gloated. "We're not just selling a product. We're selling a story. The story of the ancient master, preserved by modern technology. We'll put her face on the box. It'll be huge." Clara moved in to clear the empty shells, her knuckles white as she gripped the silver tray. They were talking about forging a master's life work, and they were doing it right in front of her, shielded by their mistaken belief that she was deaf to their language and blind to their intent. As she reached for an empty plate near Mrs. Sato, she noticed something. Tucked beside the woman's small silk purse was a furoshiki, a traditional Japanese wrapping cloth. It was a simple, indigo-dyed cloth, but one corner was meticulously repaired. A delicate, web-like pattern of gold lines crisscrossed the fabric where it had once been torn. It was kintsugi, applied not to pottery, but to cloth. It was a small, personal statement, a quiet declaration of her philosophy. Mrs. Sato saw Clara looking at it. Her eyes, ancient and knowing, met Clara's again. This time there was a flicker of acknowledgement. She knew that Clara had seen it, and she knew that Clara understood. Clara gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a gesture so small it was almost a thought. She backed away from the table, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't just a job anymore. She was now a guardian of a secret, a silent ally in a battle of worlds. Back at the service station, Mr. Albright intercepted her, his face slick with sweat. "What's taking so long? Is everything all right? Croft's party is the only one in the Chamberlain room, yet you're moving like you have a full section." "They're fine, Mr. Albright. They're discussing the deal," Clara said, stacking the plates. "Good. He wants the main courses. The Delmonico steak for the 3 gentlemen, medium rare. And for the lady?" Albright consulted his notepad, his brow furrowed. He ordered the Dover sole for her, but he specified he wants it pan-fried. Well done, with ketchup on the side. Clara stared at him. "Ketchup? For Dover sole? Sir, that's a $200 fish. The chef will have an aneurysm." "I know," Albright hissed, his voice cracking. "I told him it's traditionally served meunière. He said, and I quote, 'The old lady probably eats fish sticks. Don't waste the fancy French stuff on her. Just fry it till it's dead and give her something she recognizes.'" It was a new low. It wasn't just an insult, it was a calculated act of humiliation designed to strip Mrs. Sato of her dignity, to reinforce her otherness, her supposed lack of sophistication. He was treating a living master like a child. "If the man wants to ruin a perfect piece of fish, we will ruin it for him," Albright snapped. "Just get the order in, and for God's sake, don't let the chef see you putting the ketchup in the ramekin." When Clara returned with the main courses, the aroma of perfectly seared steak filled the private room. She placed the magnificent cuts of beef in front of Croft and his VPs. Then, with a heavy heart, she placed the plate in front of Mrs. Sato. The delicate fillet of sole, which should have been flaky and golden, was a sad, brown, desiccated thing. Beside it sat a small, gleaming white ramekin of bright red ketchup. Croft let out a braying laugh. "There you go, Grandma. Something from home." Mrs. Sato looked at the fish. She looked at the ketchup. Then she looked at Croft. For the first time that evening, she spoke in English. Her voice was thin, reedy, but clear. "Thank you," she said. The table fell silent. Croft looked momentarily stunned, then broke into a wide, smug grin. "Well, look at that. She knows a few words. You're welcome. See, we're getting along just fine." He turned to Bryce. "Probably the only 2 words she knows. Thank you and hello." Mrs. Sato picked up her fork and knife. With immense grace, she cut a small piece of the overcooked fish. She dipped it into the ketchup. She placed it in her mouth and chewed slowly, her expression unchanging. She swallowed, then took a delicate sip of her hot water. "Is good," she said, her accent thick. Croft slapped the table, roaring with laughter. "I told you, they don't know the difference." You could serve her a rubber tire with ketchup, and she'd say it was good. He leaned toward her, his voice oozing a predatory charm. "So, Sato-san, after dinner, we sign the papers. Yes? Contract. You sign." He made a scribbling motion in the air. Mrs. Sato nodded slowly. "Sign." "Good girl," Croft said, patting the table as if she were a dog. He snapped his fingers in Clara's direction without looking at her. "Waitress, more wine, and bring the check. We're celebrating the birth of a multi-billion-dollar brand." Clara stepped toward the table, the heavy bottle of Cabernet in her hand. She looked at Croft, his face flushed with wine and victory. She looked at his sycophants, grinning their approval. And she looked at Mrs. Sato, a woman of immense dignity and talent, being treated as less than human. Something inside Clara, a quiet, steady thing she had inherited from her grandfather, finally clicked into place. The rules of Ethelgard's, be invisible, be silent, the customer is always right, were screaming in her head. But the rules of Kintsugi were whispering in her heart. Sometimes things had to be broken before they could be made stronger and more beautiful. She gripped the neck of the wine bottle. Her career, her family's financial stability, it was all on the line. But some things were more important than a job. "Mr. Croft," Clara said, her voice quiet but carrying the resonant clarity of a bell. It cut through their boisterous laughter like a shard of glass. "Before I pour, I must apologize." Croft stopped laughing. He turned to her, his eyes narrowed in annoyance. It was the first time he had truly looked at her all night. "Apologize for what? For being slow?" "I apologize for my ignorance," Clara said, her heart hammering, but her voice unwavering. She looked directly at Mrs. Sato. "Sato-sensei," she said, her Japanese formal and flawless, imbued with the deep respect the title sensei demanded. "Forgive my rudeness. I did not realize who you were until I saw your furoshiki. It is an honor to have you in this establishment." The silence in the room was absolute. Kenji, the interpreter, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Croft's VP stared, their mouths agape. Croft's face began to contort, cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, rage. "What the hell was that? What did you just say to her?" Clara turned back to him, her expression calm. "I was welcoming our guest properly, something no one else here has bothered to do." She then turned her attention back to Mrs. Sato, continuing in Japanese. "Sensei, this man intends to take your designs and replicate them with plastic. He believes your soul can be digitized. He has shown you no respect for your person or for your art. You do not have to endure this." Mrs. Sato looked at Clara, and for the first time that night, a small, weary smile touched her lips. She replied in soft, elegant Japanese, A vessel must be tested to know its strength. I am testing the vessel." "What are you saying?" Croft bellowed, slamming his hand on the table. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Are you trying to sabotage my deal? Who the hell are you?" "I am a waitress, Mr. Croft," Clara said, switching back to English. "But I am also a student of the arts you are trying to purchase, and I can tell you that what you are about to sign is not a contract. It is a desecration." "You're fired!" Croft screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. "Albright, get in here! Get this insolent brat out of my sight!" But before Mr. Albright could rush in, another voice, calm and authoritative, spoke from the doorway of the Chamberlain room. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Julian." Everyone turned. Standing there was Arthur Vance, a man who represented the absolute pinnacle of Boston's old money elite. He was in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He was a legendary venture capitalist, a philanthropist, and the chairman of the board for the city's most prestigious art museum. He was also Ethelgard's most important and long-standing patron. Vance walked slowly into the room, his eyes holding a look of profound disappointment as they settled on Julian Croft. "Mr. Vance," Croft stammered, his bravado instantly deflating. You were just making a spectacle of yourself, as usual," Vance said, his voice cold. He looked past Croft to Mrs. Sato and gave a respectful bow. "Sato-sensei, it is a profound honor. I have admired your work for decades. Your whispering pine vase is the centerpiece of our museum's Japanese collection." He then looked at Clara, a flicker of curiosity in his sharp eyes. "And you, young lady, it seems you are full of surprises." The atmosphere in the Chamberlain room had been stretched to the breaking point, and with the arrival of Arthur Vance, it finally snapped. The air, once thick with Julian Croft's arrogant pronouncements, was now charged with a tense, expectant silence. Mr. Albright hovered in the doorway, his face the color of ash, looking from his insubordinate waitress to the tech billionaire, and then to the Brahmin patriarch, who could ruin his restaurant with a single displeased phone call. Julian Croft, who moments before had been a roaring lion, was now a cornered animal. Arthur Vance's presence had completely altered the power dynamic. In Croft's world of apps and algorithms, Vance was a dinosaur. But in this room, in this city, Vance was the apex predator. "Arthur," Croft said, forcing a slick, ingratiating smile. "Good to see you. I didn't know you were here. We were just closing a major partnership. This waitress, she's hysterical. She started speaking gibberish and upsetting my guest." Vance ignored him completely. His gaze remained fixed on Clara. "You speak Japanese fluently," he stated, a hint of admiration in his voice. "And you addressed Sato-sensei with the correct honorifics. Where did you learn?" Clara's mind was reeling, but the adrenaline surging through her veins sharpened her focus. "My grandfather, sir. He was from Kyoto. He taught me." "And what else did he teach you?" Vance asked, his eyes drifting down to the small, gold-flecked locket she always wore. A tiny ceramic piece she had broken and repaired herself, using the kintsugi technique her grandfather had passed down. "He taught me that some things are worth more than their market value," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "He taught me that a history of being broken and repaired is a source of beauty, not shame." Vance nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. He then turned his full attention back to Croft, his expression hardening into one of undisguised contempt. "Julian, I was dining in the main room and had the misfortune of overhearing your business strategy. You plan to take the life's work of a master craftsman, a woman designated a living cultural icon by her government, And replicate it with plastic resin and 3D printers? It's not plastic, it's a proprietary polymer, Croft retorted weakly, the sweat beading on his brow. It's innovation. We're making her art accessible to everyone. You are making a mockery, Vance corrected, his voice dangerously low. You are taking something unique and soulful and turning it into cheap, disposable garbage. It's not innovation, it's vampirism. You want to drain the lifeblood of her legacy to make a quick buck. He took a step closer to the table and looked at the sad plate of overcooked fish and the ramekin of ketchup. He didn't need to say a word. His look of withering disgust was more eloquent than any insult. Croft's face flushed with renewed anger. This is a private business deal. It has nothing to do with you, and this waitress is fired. I don't care who you are. She is not fired, Vance said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked at Mr. Albright, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. Mr. Albright, this young woman has shown more grace and cultural sensitivity in the last 5 minutes than your guest has shown all night. She will remain. In fact, she will now be joining the table. He gestured to one of the empty chairs. As a translator. A real one. Clara was stunned. She looked at Vance, then at Mrs. Sato. The elderly woman gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an invitation, a command. With trembling legs, Clara untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the service sideboard. She walked to the table and sat down opposite Croft, no longer a servant, but an equal. Now, Vance said, pulling up a chair for himself at the head of the table, effectively usurping Croft's position of power. Let's have a real conversation. Clara, please ask Sato-sensei what she truly thinks of Mr. Croft's generous offer. Clara turned to Mrs. Sato and posed the question in soft, respectful Japanese. Mrs. Sato listened, then took a long, slow sip of her water. She looked at Julian Croft, her eyes clear and perceptive, and then she began to speak. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room with a quiet authority that had been absent all evening. She spoke for several minutes, her words flowing in a calm, melodic stream. As she spoke, Clara translated, her voice a conduit for the old woman's profound wisdom and righteous anger. Sato-sensei says, Clara began, her eyes locked on Croft, that she came here not to sell her art, but to understand the man who wished to buy it. Her family has weathered famines, wars, and earthquakes. Their kiln has been burning for 400 years. They do not need your money. She says a legacy is not a brand, and the soul cannot be scanned by a machine. Croft's face was a mask of disbelief. Kenji, is this what she's saying? You told me they were desperate. The interpreter, Kenji, was sweating profusely, unable to meet anyone's eye. The financial reports. I may have exaggerated their position to facilitate the deal. Clara continued, her voice gaining strength as Mrs. Sato spoke again. Sato-sensei says that your vision of the future is a sterile and hollow thing. You create products that are designed to be replaced in a year, to be thrown away without a thought. Her work is created to be cherished for a lifetime, to be passed down through generations. It is designed to be broken and to be mended. She says you see the crack in a bowl as a flaw to be discarded. She sees it as an opportunity for gold. With this, Clara picked up a shard from a water goblet that had been knocked over and broken during Croft's early. The silence that fell in the Chamberlain room after Julian Croft's chaotic exit was not empty. It was a dense, heavy element, filled with the echoes of his rage and the scent of spilled wine that stained the antique Persian rug like a fresh wound. The overturned chair lay on its side, a monument to a collapsed ego. For a long moment, the three remaining figures were suspended in that silence, each processing the implosion from the epicenter of their own world. Clara Evans felt as though she were floating a few inches above her own body. The blood roared in her ears, a frantic counterpoint to the room's stillness. Terror and exhilaration warred within her, a nauseating cocktail that left her hands trembling and her breath shallow. She had done it. She had spoken. She, the ghost of Ethelgard's, had stood in the path of a Titan and refused to move. The act felt both impossibly large and terrifyingly small. She looked down at her hands, half expecting them to have turned to dust. They were just her hands, the nails short and practical, a small smudge of graphite still visible under one from a sketch she'd abandoned days ago. She was still just Clara, but everything had changed. The weight of that change was a physical pressure, threatening to crush her. Kiyosato sat with the same unshakable poise she had maintained all evening, but the rigid line of her spine had softened, a subtle concession to an immense weariness. The serene mask had not fallen, but Clara could now see the fine lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes, the deep fatigue of a warrior who had endured a long, ugly siege. She reached for her cup of now tepid water and took a slow, deliberate sip. Her gaze fell upon the desecrated plate of fish, the garish red of the ketchup, a final, lingering insult. She did not look at it with disgust, but with a kind of detached, scholarly curiosity, as if it were a strange artifact from a culture she would never fully comprehend. She had tested the vessel, and the vessel had proven to be hollow. Arthur Vance, the architect of this sudden, dramatic shift, let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of a century. He ran a hand over his silver hair, a rare crack in his usually imperturbable facade. His eyes, sharp and discerning, moved from the overturned chair to the resolute old woman, and finally settled on Clara. The look was not one of simple approval. It was one of profound, almost startling, recognition. It was the look of a prospector who, after sifting through tons of riverbed gravel, had finally seen the unmistakable glint of gold. "Well," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the last of the room's frantic energy. That was more entertaining than the opera. He rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, and walked over to the fallen piece of furniture. He righted it with a quiet grunt, the simple act a restoration of order, a closing of a chapter. He then turned to Clara, his expression shifting from wry amusement to a deep, resonant seriousness. "You have a great deal of courage, young lady, and a rare skill. What is your name?" "Clara Evans, sir." The words felt foreign in her own mouth, the name of a person she used to be. "Well, Clara Evans," he said, and for the first time he did not extend a hand to be shaken. Instead, he gave a slight, formal bow, a gesture of respect that was so unexpected it made Clara's breath catch. "I believe your career as a waitress is officially over. We have much to discuss." The journey home was a disorienting passage between worlds. 1 hour, she was at the center of a power struggle in a room that cost more than her mother's annual medical care. The next, she was on the number 43 bus, the scent of damp wool and exhaust fumes replacing the aroma of beeswax and old money. The bus windows were streaked with rain, blurring the city lights into abstract constellations. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool glass, trying to anchor herself. The conversation with Vance and Mrs. Sato after the chaos had been a blur of astonishing propositions. A foundation, a job, a salary that had sounded like a typographical error. It felt less like a life-changing opportunity, and more like a hallucination brought on by stress and second-hand cigar smoke. The imposter's dread began to creep in, cold and insidious. Who was she? She was a waitress, a college dropout, a girl who bought her mother's medication week to week, always watching the bank balance dwindle. She had spoken a few sentences of Japanese she'd learned from her grandfather. She had stood up to a bully. It was a single, defiant act, a flare sent up in the dark. It wasn't a qualification. Vance would wake up tomorrow, realize he'd been swept up in the drama of the evening, and his assistant would call to politely rescind the offer. Mrs. Sato would return to Japan, and Clara would be left with nothing but a termination notice from Mr. Albright and the lingering, terrifying memory of Julian Croft's face, contorted with a promise of revenge. You most of all. The words echoed in the rhythmic thump of the bus's windshield wipers. When she finally let herself into their small apartment, the familiar scent of lavender and her mother's oil paints did little to soothe her. Her mother was asleep in her room. The soft sound of her breathing, a fragile metronome, counting out the seconds of their precarious life. Clara walked into the tiny living room that doubled as her studio. On an easel sat a half-finished charcoal drawing of a shattered porcelain dove. She had been trying to capture the beauty of its fracture lines for weeks. Now, looking at it, she felt a profound sense of fraudulence. She understood the philosophy of kintsugi in theory, but her own life felt like a pile of shards she had no idea how to reassemble. She sank onto the worn sofa, the weight of the evening finally breaking through her adrenaline-fueled composure, and for the first time since her grandfather had passed away, she wept. She cried not for the victory, but for the terrifying, uncertain chasm that had just opened up at her feet. In her suite at the Four Seasons, Kiyosato was performing a ritual. She had changed from her formal kimono into a simple cotton yukata. She sat Caesar-style on the floor, not on the plush hotel carpet, but on a small tatami mat she travelled with. Before her was a small, lacquered box. With hands that were now visibly trembling from the strain of the evening, she opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a small, unassuming tea bowl. It was centuries old, dark and earthy, its surface imperfect. A jagged golden seam ran down one side, her first successful kintsugi repair, completed when she was just a girl, under her own grandfather's watchful eye. She traced the golden line with her finger. Tonight, she had felt a crack forming not in a piece of pottery, but in the very lineage she was sworn to protect. The man, Croft, he was not the first to try and commodify her family's soul, but he was the most vacuous, the most arrogant. He saw nothing but data to be mined, a brand to be exploited. He spoke of the future, yet he had no reverence for the past. He was a man who would burn a library to warm his hands for a minute. The encounter had left her feeling scoured, exhausted. And then, there was the girl, the waitress. Kurara-san. A clear, bright name. When the girl had first spoken, her Japanese not just correct, but imbued with the soft, respectful cadence of Kyoto. It was as if a bell had been struck in a silent temple. Kyo had seen beyond the uniform. She had seen the girl's eyes linger on the furoshiki, had seen the flicker of understanding, the shared language that transcended words. It was a language of reverence for the made thing, for the story held within an object. In that moment, Kyo had not seen a savior. She had seen a vessel, one that appeared plain, unassuming, easily overlooked. But when tested, it had not broken. It had held. The girl's courage was not loud or aggressive like Croft's power. It was quiet, deep, and resonant. It was like the strength of a well-fired ceramic, a strength forged in immense heat and pressure. Kyo picked up the old tea bowl. Perhaps, she thought, the future of her art was not just in preserving the old pieces, but in finding the right hands in which to place the knowledge of how to mend what is broken. The thought did not erase her weariness, but it settled deep within her, a single, warm ember in the cold ash of the evening. Julian Croft didn't retreat. Men like him never did. He did not see the events at Ethelgard's as a humiliation, but as a hostile system failure. His world was binary, ones and zeros, success and failure, dominance and submission. He had been denied, and his internal operating system could not compute the reason. He paced the floor of his penthouse apartment, a sterile glass box overlooking the city. The lights of Boston spread below him like a circuit board he was meant to control. His VPs, Bryce and Chad, had tried to debrief, offering useless platitudes about bad optics and unforeseen variables. He had fired them both via a curt text message before they'd even made it to the lobby. Kenji, the interpreter, had vanished, wisely choosing self-preservation over loyalty. Croft was alone, surrounded by smart technology that felt profoundly stupid. He yelled at his AI assistant to play music, to dim the lights, to find him information, but nothing could soothe the raging, narcissistic injury. He fixated on the waitress. Clara Evans. It was an impossibly common name. She was a nobody, a background process that had suddenly and catastrophically malfunctioned. She shouldn't have mattered. He had the money, the power, the vision. She had a tray and an apron. The equation didn't balance. And Vance was a fossil, a relic of an analog age. His power was based on handshakes and whispers, on unwritten rules and social codes Croft had always disdained as inefficient. His first instinct was to destroy. He spent the night orchestrating a digital blitzkrieg. His fingers flew across a holographic keyboard, leveraging his network of paid influencers, bot farms, and media contacts. The first wave was the flood of negative reviews for Ethelgard's, a crude but often effective tactic. The second wave was more sophisticated, a targeted smear campaign painting Vance as a senile gatekeeper, stifling innovation, and Sato's company as a bankrupt, irrelevant antique shop. He would rewrite the narrative. He would brute force reality until it aligned with his will. He watched the metrics on his screen, the retweets and angry comments piling up, and felt the first flicker of his power returning. He was Julian Croft. He did not lose. He simply adjusted the algorithm of the world. But the world he was trying to manipulate was not an algorithm. It was a story, and he had fundamentally misread the characters. When the fraudulent reviews vanished overnight, he was shocked. When his smear campaign was met not with outrage, but with a feature piece in the Boston Globe titled "The Soul of the Shard," he was baffled. The article, penned by a Pulitzer-winning journalist who happened to be an old friend of Vance's, didn't just recount the dinner, it elevated it into a modern fable. It was David and Goliath, but with porcelain. It framed Croft not as a visionary, but as a barbarian at the gates of culture. The story went viral, but not in the way he had intended. The hashtag #Shahkintsugi started trending. People were posting pictures of their own mended objects, a chipped mug from a grandmother, a glued-together toy from childhood. He had tried to start a fire, and had instead illuminated the very thing he sought to destroy. His investors, who cared little for art, but a great deal for public perception, started calling. Their voices were laced with a new, unsettling tone: concern. The weeks that followed were a period of careful, deliberate construction. The Vance Sato Foundation was not born in a press release, but in a series of quiet, intensive meetings in Vance's Beacon Hill townhouse. The room was lined with leather-bound books and smelled of old paper and lemon oil. At first, Clara felt like a ghost there, too. She sat on the edge of a plush armchair, clutching a legal pad, listening as lawyers and accountants spoke a language of trusts and endowments that was as foreign to her as Croft's tech speak. Vance watched her. He saw her fear, her reticence. During a break in one meeting, as lawyers argued over a tax clause, he led her to a glass cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside was a collection of antique clocks, none of them working. "My father was a watchmaker," Vance said quietly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Not a famous one. A simple craftsman in a small shop. He believed that to understand something, you had to be willing to take it apart, to see how the pieces fit together. He taught me that the most complex mechanisms are built from the simplest, most honest components: a gear, a spring, a lever. Men like Croft see the world from the top down. They see the finished product, the stock price. They never bother to look at the gears. He tapped the glass. "He would have liked your grandfather." He then turned to her. "Clara, I did not bring you here to be a silent observer. I brought you here for your perspective. You understand the gears. When these men talk about outreach and engagement, I need you to tell us what that actually means. How do we connect this art to people who have never set foot in a museum? You are the bridge. So please, stop acting like a guest and start acting like a founder." It was the permission she needed. In the next meeting, when the discussion turned to the inaugural exhibition, Clara finally spoke. She talked about accessibility, about holding workshops for children, about creating digital resources that explained the philosophy, not just the history. She spoke of her grandfather's belief that art was not just for the wealthy to own, but for everyone to understand. The lawyers stopped talking about tax codes and started to listen. Mrs. Sato, observing via a video link from Kyoto with a new, highly professional translator, gave a slow, deep nod of approval. Clara felt a gear click into place inside her. She wasn't an imposter. She was a component, a vital part of a new and beautiful machine. Her true education, however, took place not in a boardroom, but in a small, light-filled studio Vance had rented for Mrs. Sato's extended stay. It was there that the real work began. Mrs. Sato, or Kyo-sensei, as Clara now called her, was a demanding and patient teacher. She taught Clara that kintsugi was a discipline of the senses. She had to learn the smell of the raw urushi lacquer, a scent as old and earthy as a forest floor. She had to learn the feel of grinding gold into a powder so fine it became like dust motes in a sunbeam. Most importantly, she had to learn how to see. "Do not look at the break," Sensei told her one afternoon, holding up a shattered plate. "Look at the michi, the path. The break is not random. It tells the story of the force that struck it. It has its own energy, its own logic. You are not erasing the story, you are illuminating it." Under Sensei's guidance, Clara's hands, once accustomed to the weight of silver trays, learned the delicate pressure of the brush, the painstaking process of applying the lacquer, waiting for it to cure, and then dusting it with gold. Each step was a meditation. In the quiet of the studio, she began to mend more than just pottery. She mended the part of herself that felt broken by circumstance, the part that believed she was unworthy. She learned that the lines of gold were not meant to hide the damage, but to honor it. Her family's struggles, her suspended education, her years of invisibility, they were not flaws. They were the cracks that, when filled, could become the most beautiful parts of her story. 6 months after the dinner at Ethelgard's, the Foundation's first exhibition, Golden Scars, the Art of Kyosato, opened at the Museum of Fine Arts. The buzz was immense. The story of the waitress who stood up to the billionaire had become a local legend, a narrative that had captured the public's imagination. Clara stood near the entrance of the main gallery, not in an apron, but in a simple, elegant dark blue dress. She was not a ghost. She was the Foundation's program coordinator, her name on the wall alongside Vance's and Sato's. She watched the crowd, art critics and students, wealthy patrons and families with young children, a cross-section of the city she had only ever served. In the center of the room, on a stark black pedestal, sat the collection's most talked-about piece. It was not an ancient vase, but a simple, modern water goblet. Its stem was slender, its bowl elegantly curved, and running through it were 3 delicate, shimmering veins of gold. The placard beside it read, "The Chamberlain Goblet, glass, urushi lacquer, 24K gold, repaired by Clara Evans, under the guidance of Kyo Sato." A man stood before the goblet for a long time, his back to Clara. He was dressed in a hoodie that was too expensive, and sneakers that looked out of place. It was Julian Croft. He had not been invited, but he had come anyway. He looked thinner, his usual aura of aggressive energy replaced by something hollowed out and brittle. He stared at the goblet, his expression unreadable. He had tried to buy it, offering Vance a 7-figure sum through a lawyer, a final, desperate attempt to own the narrative. The offer was, of course, refused. He stood there for another minute, then turned and walked away, not with a storm of fury, but with the quiet, shuffling gait of a man who had finally encountered a system he could neither hack nor buy. He had been rendered irrelevant, the worst possible fate for a man who believed his existence was the only one that mattered. Later, as the crowds began to thin, Vance and Kyo-sensei found Clara by the goblet. "He came," Vance said, his voice neutral. "I saw," Clara replied. Kyo-sensei looked at the goblet, then at Clara. She spoke in Japanese, her voice soft. "He sees a broken glass. He sees his failure. He cannot see the beauty. Some vessels are fired incorrectly. They can never be mended. They can only be ground back into dust." She then placed a gentle hand on Clara's arm. Her touch was light, but it felt as solid as the earth. "You, Kurara-san, you are a good vessel, fired in a hot kiln. You did not shatter, you only cracked. And now you are stronger, more beautiful." Clara looked at her reflection, fractured and remade in the golden lines of the goblet. She saw the girl who had poured water, the student who had studied art, the granddaughter who had learned reverence, the woman who had found her voice. They were all there, held together by a history that was no longer a source of shame, but a map of her resilience. The breaks were not the end of her story. They were the beginning. And the gold was not just a repair. It was a revelation,